Hello, welcome to the Bookcast Club, a bookish podcast for people who love talking books, warts and all. I'm Jenny and I'm here with my co-host Sarah.
Hello.
And today we're joined by Mercedes from the very popular booktube channel Mercy's Bookish Musings. So welcome to the podcast, Mercedes.
Thank you.
We've wanted you to come on for ages. I don't know how long we've been talking about that. Trying to get Mercedes on. Me and Sarah have been kind of plotting away.
Yeah,
trying to think,
that's true. At least a year, I think. Me being like, I'd love to get Mercedes on.
Yeah, no, so we're really pleased that you're here.
Oh, good.
Today's episode, we're going to focus on non-fiction because, well, you both are big readers of non-fiction, so we thought it would be a good episode to do with the three of us. And I'm not sure we've done a non-fiction episode for ever, if ever.
Not with me, so effectively no.
So Mercedes, before we start, how long have you been doing YouTube for?
About 9 years, I think. Yeah, which is quite mad, isn't it?
And you're just short of 40,000.
Yeah, although I've been just short of that for about 4 years now, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think I gain at the same rate as sort of losing. And I think in large part it's because I think YouTube's such a changeable platform and I've not really moved with the times. I love watching reading vlogs, but I hate filming them. And I think that's just become such a big part of what the booktube community is now, which I love as a viewer. But I just cannot be bothered. So I'm just old school. I just do like TBRs, wrap-ups, reviews, and it's sort of, that's not such a large part of what booktube is anymore.
Yeah, you don't want to set up a nicely lit shot of like brewing a cup of tea.
No, I've tried, and it's I just feel like an idiot. I just can't do it.
They're hard work as well.
Oh God, yeah.
Like, people that make them look easy, they're really not. I mean, I think maybe I attempted a few back in the day. And they're just so much harder to edit because you end up with so many clips.
Yeah.
And end up quite conscious about how you're making a cup of tea.
Yeah, definitely. And I've got really like shaky hands. I always have had. So it's just a nightmare. Like if I'm trying to film as I'm walking or like film a shot of my food, it's just awful for anyone to watch. So I just always delete it. And
Blurry food.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. Well, I think part of your channel's charm is that you are just the same as when you started. I think you're one of the only people that I've probably consistently watched from whenever I discovered you, which must have been near the start.
Yeah, probably.
So yeah, I don't think there's many people that I have followed for that amount of time. Maybe Jen, for as long as Jen Campbell's been doing it for, and Jean as well. But other than that, yeah. So I think you must be doing something right.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I just keep uploading.
Yeah. I think when I moved to the Netherlands, which was 5 years ago, I know I had already been watching you for a number of years, so I don't know, maybe it's just me and Jen, I don't know, we just don't have we're just happy
biggest fans.
Stay as we are. Keep watching.
So how are you both doing? Any news? Anything exciting going on?
No. My mum asks me this every week. She's like, what's happened? Has anything happened? I'm like, no, just
nothing.
My life on repeat. Not that that's a bad thing, but I quite like having a life where nothing happens.
What about you, Sarah?
Not really. I'm trying to sort of nervously book some various holidays this summer because I haven't been able to do that for the last couple of years. So trying to book a trip to Iceland. That's what's been happening this week. That's about it. So sort of not actually going on holiday, but sort of thinking about trying to. That's been the highlight.
I love Iceland. Me and Alice went a few years ago to Reykjavik. Yeah, it was just really nice. One of my favourite places I've ever been, actually. Loved it. It's expensive.
Yeah, I've heard,
yeah, it will be expensive.
Yeah, me and her were eating from various like like street food kind of places because just couldn't afford the restaurants or anything. But yeah, it's really nice there. And we went in winter. Yeah, we went at Christmas. So they only get like 4 hours of daylight, which is really weird. Just sort of 4 hours in the afternoon in light, and otherwise it's all like twinkly lights and it's very pretty.
Did you see the Northern Lights?
No, we didn't. It's cloudy. So we didn't see them, which is kind of lucky in a way because I think a lot of people book proper trips to go out, and we were only there a few nights, but yeah, people book trips to go and you'd see that they'd been cancelled, and yeah, I assume you just get your money back if you don't get to go. But no, it's cloudy, so no Northern Lights. But yeah, I've just got back from London yesterday. I went to watch a musical, but while I was there, I thought I'd do like me and Mercedes used to, when I did BookTube, used to do the like London meetups with all the other booktubers and do sort of little book crawls.
Yeah,
bookshop crawls. Yeah. Which is just, they were super fun. Peak bookish nerdiness, but yeah, they were great, weren't they?
Yeah, they were.
So
really
I went
good.
to a few of the shops that we used to go to. So moving on, have either of you got any good books to talk about?
Sure. Do you want to tell us what you're like currently or recently have been reading, Mercedes?
Well, I'm being quite good recently and only reading one book at a time, which I'm very much enjoying, because it stops me getting a bit overwhelmed by choice. The start of this year, the last few years, I've wanted to read a lot more epic fantasy because I do love it, but I just don't make time for it. So I had a list of 12 I wanted to get through, and I just read the 5th one, so I'm getting through them at quite a rate,
nice.
which I'm pleased about. But I was gutted. It was the Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, which came out, I think, last year. It's quite a chunky book. And I read her first book in a fantasy duology. It's a bit odd. Sometimes I can't quite put my finger on what doesn't work for me, because like she writes, like the world's brilliant, the magic system's great, her descriptions are beautiful, but somehow it just doesn't really land. Like the characters feel like characters. I didn't really feel like I cared all that much about them. And in the blurb is that it's told from the perspective of two women, one who is a sort of royal princess who's being imprisoned, and another is a maidservant who's going to take her food and things to her, and they develop this relationship. But actually there's like 5 or 6 other point of view characters.
Oh, okay. So it's actually a relatively small part of the story then.
Yeah, well,
I
guess they take up more of the narrative, but it's not that insular. You get lots of other voices who are like, I felt not that well developed. So I was a bit disappointed, because I feel like it had the bones to be a really good story. And a lot of people said, I was reading reviews, and a lot of people said, and I agree, it almost feels like a prologue, because it ends at a place where there's clearly going to be loads of shit go down in the next book. But actually in this book, not loads happened. But I'm still determined to continue with reading these books and find some that are brilliant, because and some of them I've read off the list I've really enjoyed, so I know that they're out there.
Epic fantasy is so hard to find. It's so hard to find good. I sort of have the same struggle with you. I know you find it really hard to find stuff that really lands with you. I have the same struggle. It's just like, I don't know. And I just feel with fantasy readers sometimes there's such a difference in terms of what people actually, what they value in a fantasy book can be really hard. Even people you think might have a similar taste to you, when you actually get to reading it, you're like, oh, this is not what I wanted at all.
Yeah.
So I find it really difficult. And because they're so bloody long, you've got to read a couple of 100 pages before you have an idea about whether it's something you would like or not, which is frustrating. Yes, I just finished the book that I was talking about in the last episode, which was Dead Mountain by Donnie Eichar, which is actually a non-fiction book, funnily enough, which is about it's written by a journalist who's American, and it is about a group of hikers in 1959 in Russia who go hiking in the snow and go missing. And then there's a big search party looking for them, and then they're all found. I think some of them are found immediately, and then the rest of the half of the party is found like many weeks later under quite mysterious circumstances. They had all left their tent for some unknown reason. Quite a lot of them had died from hypothermia, but others had died from really substantial head traumas and other kind of wounds. One of them was missing her tongue. A lot of them weren't wearing clothes. None of them were wearing shoes, and it's a really weird sort of mystery. And this was published a couple of years ago, and the guy who wrote it is a journalist who became sort of obsessed with this case, and he started trying to figure out what happened back in 1959. And so he starts talking to everyone who he could talk to who was involved with the investigation at the time, and all the kind of new science, because there's a lot of discussion about what kind of natural events could possibly have happened conceivably at that time. So it took a lot of modelling and stuff. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it, actually. I was often... These kind of books, these non-fiction books, they often don't go anywhere, and they sort of...
Yeah, I was going to say, like, obviously, I don't know if it's a book you should spoil, but, like, is there a resolution?
He comes up with a theory of what he thinks happens and a narrative of how it all happened, which does make sense. I was reading it with a friend of mine. We have a little non-fiction book club, and we both thought it was pretty good, but I was pleasantly surprised that he actually did have a proper theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more, and that's still interesting, but there's always a sense of disappointment when you get to the end and you're like, oh, like, I've just been given all the information, but not actually, like, pieced it together.
For sure, the first third, when he was just sort of laying out the weirdness of it, I was like, oh, this is really good. Oh, I really hope this is going somewhere. And I haven't just been given, so many non-fictions end up like that. They're like, we'll never know. But this wasn't one of them.
I like the sound of this one when you talked about it in the last episode.
Yeah, I don't think I've read anything like that. Like, there's all these, like, mountaineering... I mean, I've watched some of the documentaries and films, and I find them fascinating, but I don't think I've ever read a book that's based on some sort of, what would you call it, like, outdoor expedition that ends in disaster. I feel like that's the sort of genre, isn't it?
We'll get onto that later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I love stuff set in Everest. I think we both do, don't we, Jen? I love people doing insane things. Yeah, this was after the couple of ones that I've read before have been quite badly written, or I don't really like that super journalistic style where they're sort of narrating it themselves. They're like, we go here, we meet in this cafe, he's wearing this.
Oh, God, I literally detest being told what someone's wearing. I'm like, how could you possibly know?
Or when they meet someone, they always meet someone for a coffee. They meet some journalist or something and they talk to each other and they're like, she orders this matcha latte, I get this. I'm like, okay, great.
Yeah.
It's just really, I hate that. He didn't do any of this. It was pretty decent, I would say.
And what was that called again, Sarah?
It's called Dead Mountain by Donnie Eichar.
Go on, Mercedes, what are you currently reading?
I'm reading a book called Yellow Bird, Oil, Murder and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country by Sierra Crane Murdoch. It's a long title, isn't it? And I am on the hunt for, and I was listening actually, in your last episode you had a discussion about true crime and the sort of merits and problems of true crime, and in large part I have massive problems with true crime because I think it's essentially a morbid curiosity in how far people are willing to go to do, abhorrent things, and a fascination with those abhorrent things rather than the victims. But in particular, I think what true crime can be, and I hope will be in the future, is actually a discussion about the sort of social issues which lead to crimes being allowed to happen. The lack of social services, the lack of good policing and all these things. And this book is about a white man who goes missing on a Indian reserve in North Dakota, who is working there as a part of the fracking industry. And he goes missing and it's not really looked into. And a Indigenous woman who's recently come out of prison called Lisa Yellowbird becomes sort of obsessed with his case, and she admits that she's throughout her life been an addict in many ways, and she thinks this is sort of a replacement for some of her addictions. And I'm sort of about a quarter of the way in, so I'm not that far, but it seems to be a discussion. It's a discussion about all the interconnections of how much money fracking brings into reserves, which is a really big thing in North America, but how that wealth is really unevenly distributed, and how a lot of that is, these people are encouraged to sell their land for $1 when it's then sold on to somebody else for like so much more money. And I get the sense that his going missing and is going to be tied up into all that sort of politics of the reserve and the money made between the people who run the reserve and the people making a profit from it. So it seems to be more focused on the sort of true crime I like, rather than, who did it, and exactly it's talking much more about the reserve and fracking and all those things, which I just find really interesting.
That does sound interesting. When was it published?
Only a couple of years ago. And the weird thing about this sort of thing, I'd always rather this was written. She's a white author and she's not from the reserve, but really the book's about Lisa Yellowbird rather than so much about the man who went missing. So it's quite an interesting sort of framing of the case. But yeah, I think it only came out about 2 years ago.
Okay. Is there a podcast connected to this book?
I don't know, there could be, because I was just looking up the reserve on YouTube earlier. I was just interested to see what it looked like, and loads of videos came up that I think were going to ruin the book for me, so I didn't watch them. So I think it must have been a pretty big thing, so I wonder if there has also been a podcast.
Yeah, because the name, that Lisa Yellowbird, that's familiar. I think I remember hearing from her on a podcast, a sort of small podcast series about this, but I don't remember the book at all. So I have to see if I can I'll try and scrape through my own poor memory and see if I can remember it, and we can put it in the show notes for people. Or it'll be someone completely different name, different country. See what I can find. But it does sound, it's really ringing a bell about, her talking about her interest in the case. She seemed like a really interesting person, actually. And she was talking about some of the realities of policing on reserves and how it actually works and how complicated it is.
Yeah, it's super complicated. And to be honest, like, you know, the chapters I found the most fascinating have been about her life, her family, and how the reserve works. Not so much about what may have happened to this individual man. I think it's a much broader narrative than that.
Well, I've mainly been reading. We've got an upcoming episode where we will be discussing Alice's favourite books. So that's what I'm reading at the moment. The Time Traveller's Wife and The Poisonwood Bible.
Okay.
So those are my two current reads. But I've also recently started a non-fiction book about the pill, which is called How the Pill Changes Everything by Dr. Sarah E. Hill. So she's a professor of psychology, and the book is about how the pill affects how we think and our emotions and how we behave. And I've only really just started it. The tone's a little bit odd, which I don't know if I should read reviews beforehand, because it always kind of sways my thinking. And I definitely read some reviews that said that her tone's quite patronising. So I don't know whether this is genuinely me thinking it or because I've read other people say that. But I guess she does write in a sort of, I don't know, trying to be cool millennial style that can be a little bit irritating, I think, in non-fiction. I don't think she concludes, like, either way that taking the pill is good or bad, which is good, because I didn't want it to be like a biased account of taking the pill. And yeah, the subject matter I think might be really interesting, just because I was on the pill myself for so long, and I'll just be intrigued to see what her take on it all is. It's got a very nice cover.
Yeah,
right.
I have seen
draw me in.
I've seen the cover.
It's saying her tone is quite millennial. So's the cover. Apparently, I'm fine with the millennial.
Is that the yellow one?
That's fine. It's
with
kind
the
of
pink.
pinky, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe the packet of pills is.
I think it
Yeah,
is
the
got a
yellow.
packet. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I actually nearly read that a few months ago because I'm also really interested in this. But I was put off by the reviews, so I'm glad you're reading it, and you can provide.
I can tell you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because some of the things that I've read in reviews, I've picked up on, and now I don't know if I've genuinely picked up on them myself. Yeah, she definitely talks a lot about, you know, sexual desire and stuff when you're on the pill, and making reference to like hot men and things, and I'm like, really? I definitely don't think it necessarily makes you, when you come off the pill, attracted to just, you know, what's deemed to be an attractive man in society. I'm just not sure I believe that. So there's stuff in there like that that's a bit off, I think.
Yeah.
So we'll see how it goes, because I'm not that far into it.
Because I think that one's been out for a couple of years, hasn't it? Maybe. It's quite recent,
so.
Isn't it? But there's a lot more books coming out, isn't there, about like women's health? And I desperately want, you know, some of them to be good. But I think
we live in hope.
Yeah, I think not that it's asking a lot, but I think what I would want from any of these discussions would be for it to be really nuanced. And I think a lot of people just come from their bias. So, like, you know, and a lot of those sort of that sort of narrative, I would assume, is probably going to be quite like straight focused.
Yeah.
You know, disregard that queer people exist who take the pill also, you know, and perhaps not, but
she like explicitly disregards queer people,
which is ridiculous, because some people with endometriosis who are queer would be prescribed the contraceptive pill to control their symptoms. So, you know,
it's one of the big critiques of the book, actually. She's like, I'm going to talk about women and women only, so it's not cis women.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
like,
just it's such
heterosexual cis women.
Yeah.
And she's really explicit at the start that that's what she's going to focus on. So it's a little bit off.
Yeah.
But it's also who are taking the pill as contraceptive, which is not.
Yeah, exactly. It's not how it's always used, is it? So I don't know.
I mean, I was started on it when I was a teenager for a period problem. Like, not for that at all.
No, exactly. Yeah. I'll report back.
Yeah.
I've got a feeling it might just annoy me, so
yeah,
we'll see how it goes.
It's a shame though, because it's a really important topic, I think. Yeah, which probably is a good segue actually into why we actually read non-fiction.
You two definitely read more than I do, so what is it that you enjoy about non-fiction so much?
Okay, it's always been something that I wanted to read more of, because I think it's really, find it really interesting. I want to learn more. I learn a lot through fiction, but sometimes if it's a issue that I just want to understand the mechanics of it a little bit more. And sometimes fiction is amazing, I think, for understanding how someone's perspective might be different from yours and their like personal experience. But if you want to understand something about like in a more meta way, how this actually works, what's actually happening, I think non-fiction is probably a little bit better, or that can be a little bit more successful in non-fiction. I have to say I found it really difficult. It's only been the last couple of years that I've actually been able to find good non-fiction, because I find it really, really difficult to find good recommendations for non-fiction, because often I do feel that non-fiction is marketed on the premise of how important the topic is. Like, let's discuss, I don't know, women's health or whatever, this mountain, whatever it is. And when you actually go to read it, I find it can be not that well written. And you pick it up because you want to learn about the topic, not because you have heard like, oh, this book is really well written and, you know, it's interesting. So it took me a while to try and figure out how to find those kind of books that are well written, and also about really interesting topics. So I've had to find a couple of key reviewers. You are one of them, Mercedes, who would actually have like decent reviews. Imagine if I said the opposite. To sift through Mercedes. Yes, that's why I read it. I find it also a little bit difficult sometimes because I am a scientist, so I do want it to be reasonable, like pretty academic without it being too dry. But so sometimes nonfiction can be either super, super dry, which is not always what I want, or quite sort of conversational, which is also not what I want. I sort of want something in between. So that can also be hard to find.
Agreed. I think and more in recent years, I just want to know everything. And not so much, when I say everything, what I mean is, when anything comes up on the news, I think, okay, I need to understand this more. And so I click those articles that are like 10 things you need to know about, you know, this historically. And I read that article and I'm like, that's not helped me at all. Like, it's the bare bones. And so I just feel constantly disappointed in what I was taught at school when I could have instead been taught all these things. And I think maybe this is a bit too hopeful, but I think the world would be a much better place if actually we had much more context for, you know, history, politics, social justice issues, and I think that's what I read non-fiction for, really. And again, I completely agree. I struggle sometimes, a lot of the times, when a non-fiction book is written to inform. I think a lot of the time the writing isn't great, and I think I would rather it was dry than conversational.
Me too.
Because at least I'm sort of gaining information. And another thing I struggle with is just it touching on all the things I wanted to touch on. I think it's maybe having a bit of a moment, and there is lots of really great non-fiction being published.
If we get our non-fiction recommendations from you, Mercedes, where do you get your non-fiction recommendations from?
It's a very small circle.
And that's a hard one, you know, because actually there's a lot of people I watch who talk about non-fiction whose recommendations I've tried and don't necessarily work for me, because I think, you know, people want different things from non-fiction. So I get my recommendations from, there's some publishers I know who focus on publishing non-fiction. So I look into that. Also, whenever I read a non-fiction book that's educational, I'll always read the bibliography at the back and see where they like got some of. So if there's one part of the book that I was like, oh, I'd like to know more about that, then I'll look at the back to see what book they mentioned. And I just spend so many hours wasting my life looking into what I should read rather than reading. So it's probably more that I, because I have actually no hobbies and don't particularly like socialising, that I just have a lot of time to do that, really. That's probably why.
You said something funny, one of your videos, you said something that, like, whenever I go on my library website, which is about 10 times a day or something.
I'm obsessed. Do you know, I was busy the other day. Oh yeah, we're going back to work on a Wednesday one day now, and I got to 5 o'clock on the walk home, and I thought, I've not looked at my library app for then. I was devastated. Usually it's like a tick. You know how other people look on social media? I couldn't care less about social media. I'm like, have they given me anything new at the library? It's like, you know.
It's like the first thing I do every morning when I sit at my computer to see what they've added.
Yeah,
overnight to the catalogue. So yeah, there's a couple of YouTubers. You're one of them. Also, do you know Britta Berler, the German
Yes.
YouTuber? I find she reads a lot of nonfiction, and she reads really widely. She's also a lawyer, so I find her recommendations tend to be at a similar kind of level to what I would like, or similar tone, let's say. Let's not say similar level.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting thing, because I find nonfiction hard to recommend, and it's difficult in how to word that. But some people want something that's, I guess, introductory is a word I hear lots of people use, but one person's introductory won't be another person's, and there's no real way to gauge that from a review. So you just have to, like you say, find someone who you think is similar and hope for the best.
Where also there's a couple of prizes that I follow, not because I necessarily want to read like their whole short list or long list, but often you'll see throughout the year the same kind of books kind of cropping up. So I use that as a bit of, so I'm currently I'm about to start reading Entangled Life by Melon Sheldrake, because that sort of keeps coming up. That's the mushroom book.
The mushroom book.
Yeah. Yeah, I just read the introduction, so I don't know if I can really say I've read it, I've started reading it or not. But anyway, and yeah, there's like Bailie Gifford and I think the Walter Scott Prize and all those kind of things. So I just sort of follow them on Instagram and take notes. And I also look at my library app a lot, because they have a whole nonfiction section, so I really like to keep an eye on what they're adding. And that's how I'll just get it from the library and start it. And if I like it, then I'll keep going. Yeah. And if not, then I won't.
Prize-wise, I follow the ones you mentioned, and I think the Welcome Trust do it.
Oh, yeah, Welcome Trust.
Yeah, but the one I quite like to follow, which is a bit different to those, is the Graywolf publishers in the US. They're an independent press, and every 1 or 2 years they pick a book to win, and that's the one they publish. So it's not like a long list and a short list. It's just that, it wins and it gets published. And they tend to publish quite, I guess, experimental non-fiction that's a mix of memoir and an exploration of a subject, which is something I also really like. I think another thing that non-fiction can give is, if you like reading literary fiction, then I struggle to see how you wouldn't enjoy memoir, because it feels like it's the ability to like get closer to those discussions than you could in a novel. Or like some people don't want to share their life, and that's absolutely fine. But I think some people put their own experience in a novel, but there's like a filter. Well, the memoir's just removing that filter. Yeah,
definitely. I think there's a very thin line between some of the more auto-fiction-y sort of literary fiction, and then something like, I don't know, like I Am, for example. This is where we take a little break to tell you all about the different ways you can support the podcast, some of which are totally free. A really effective and easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. And if you listen on Spotify, you can now very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. You can sign up to our free monthly newsletter where we share even more book recommendations and all the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you would like to support the podcast financially, we also have a Patreon account. You can sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and our top tier will get you both of those things and personalised book recommendations. We just get you to fill in a survey, and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We will also send you books in the post. There are over 15 bonus episodes that you can get instant access to if you sign up as a Patreon today. The link is in our show notes. But however you choose to show your support, we as always want to say a huge thank you. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners.
So we're going to move on to sharing our favourite non-fiction books now. I think we've got 2 or 3 each.
So my first one is a memoir. As I said, I absolutely love memoirs, and I particularly like memoirs if they're available on audio read by the author, which this one is. And that is Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Cho. Have either of you read it?
Nope.
I'd say if you are a mother, it is perhaps a little bit of a difficult read. So or if you're, going through the process of falling pregnant, because it is about that. Catherine Cho, her and her partner are Korean American, but they moved over to the UK to live. And she had a little boy, and it's part of Korean tradition to stay indoors with the baby for sort of quite a prolonged period of time. And then you have sort of a naming ceremony, and that's when all the family meet, and that's the sort of first moment the baby then goes out into the world. and they decided to go and visit their family in the US before that time period was up. And a lot of the older members of her family were a bit sort of judgmental about that. And effectively she suffers with pretty horrific postpartum psychosis. And so the book opens immediately being split, and I think this was a really smart way to do it, because it opens with her already in the on the ward in the US in a mental hospital, and she's confused as to why she's there. And then each chapter splits and goes back to her meeting her husband and having her little boy, and leads up to the point of her being in the ward, and then the bit in the ward leads up to the point of her leaving the ward. And so you don't actually find out about what led her to being taken there against her will by her family until quite a way into the book, which I think was a good way to do it, because it removes any judgment, because you already know her and have experienced all this time with her before you find out about some of the quite horrific things she went through. But the book's absolutely beautifully written. It reads in some ways like poetry. There's lots of really great discussions about Korean tradition and beliefs, and how a lot of that pressure sort of played its part in her psychosis. One thing I found really interesting is one of the girls I went to uni with and we lived together, she did a year, I don't know what you call it anymore, you know, when you go work for a year and it's part of your degree. And she worked on a mother and baby unit in London, which was specifically for mothers who were sent into a ward for mental health problems, but they were sent there with their children. And so when I read this book, I was thinking, this is really weird, like surely she should have been sent to one of those wards. And towards the end of the book, she acknowledges that that doesn't exist in the US, and the children are always separated from their mothers, and actually research has shown that's not the right thing to do. And she was also prescribed a drug that we wouldn't prescribe in the UK because we view it as really extreme. And so she's a British citizen, and she's just travelling, obviously grew up in the US, but she's gone back there to visit family. But if it had just happened like, you know, a few weeks differently, she would have never been separated from her child. She would have been kept on a ward with him. And there's just, you know, sort of, it's brilliant. It sort of brings quite a few issues together, but as well as that, is just absolutely beautifully written. And she narrates it like on audio. It's absolutely phenomenal.
I've not heard of it before, I don't think. I've just been Googling away trying to find the cover, and I don't think I've heard of it, but that sounds, yeah, it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it sounds excellent. But it's quite dark. It's like, is the
feeling
it
is.
Quite dark?
Yeah, it is. It is quite dark, and part of her psychosis is that, and I don't know anything about Dantes Inferno, so this is going to show my complete ignorance here, but she believes she's going into Dantes Inferno, and that her husband is in there with her, and so she thinks all the nurses and doctors trying to help her are all coming, you know, into the Inferno with her, and so she's trying to get everybody to believe her and to sort of escape. And so, yeah, there's moments where you're just thinking, God, how did you survive this? It is, you know,
God,
horrific. The way she talks about it, and one thing I found really interesting was when you're reading it, you do think it's clear that if some of your family members, both her family and her partner's family, had done things differently, it may not have happened. But she gives you the facts to sort of think that yourself without actually saying it, because like she has to deal with the repercussions of this book being published. So she sort of discusses some of the sort of suffocation that she felt when staying with them, but she doesn't say if they hadn't done this wouldn't have happened. So I think she does it in a really fair way. Brilliant. And I think it's something that happens a lot more than people talk about, because there's a lot of shame attached to it. And she says in particular, in Korean culture, that sort of thing carries a lot of shame. Anything she brings out in future, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, I'd 100% pre-order it.
So one of the things I've written down is actually memoir is what I've written that I really quite enjoy. There's a couple that I really like. One you've already mentioned, Sarah, and that's Maggie O'Farrell's I Am, which I really, really loved. It's funny because that's the first book that I read by her, which is probably not the way around to do it. But yeah, it's the first book I ever read by her, and I really, really loved it. I just thought it was really cleverly structured to start with. So I can't remember how many sort of essays or you don't call them stories, but you know what I mean. There's like 20 or something.
17.
17. 17. Yeah. Is that subtitle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember.
And it's like her 17 sort of
she calls
close encounters-ish.
Yeah,
with death.
Yeah, brushes with death.
Yeah. And I just thought it was a really, really I always think if I was going to write a memoir myself, what would my clever hook be? Because I just thought it was a really clever way of like reflecting on her own life. And there's a few instances in that, or life events that she's been through that I've also been through. And I think if you can connect with an author on that level, definitely the books that I've really loved that are memoir is where I've really connected with the author and their experience. And I really loved that book. The audio, I listened to it, it's really good, but the audio is not narrated by Maggie O'Farrell, which is a shame.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, I thought it was really great. And I bought a copy afterwards, which I very, very rarely do. And the other one I wanted to mention, I've definitely talked about it on the podcast before, numerous times, and Alice loves it as well. I thought it was worth mentioning again, is Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. So the sort of subtitle of this book is Advice on Love and Life from Dear Sugar. So she used to be an anonymous agony aunt called Sugar. I cannot remember, Alice would know, but I can't remember the newspaper she used to do it for. But people would write in to her with various kind of life problems, both big and small, and her responses are just so beautiful and compassionate and warm, but sometimes harsh and to the point and blunt, but always delivered with like a real warmth. And I just really loved it. And I can't remember how many letters were in there, probably loads of them, but I really felt you only needed to connect with one or two, well, one even. If you just connect with one of those responses, I think you'd really love it. And she's lived quite a full life, but a difficult life, so all her responses kind of come from this personal experience. And I read Wild before I read this. I really hated it. I'm not very good with the like white privileged woman going off to find herself. I hated Eat, Pray, Love as well, by the way, so that's not my kind of thing. And I didn't like Wild, but I love this collection. And I was just looking up, I tried to find my review that I wrote, but I did it on an old blog, like I wrote a full review of it. But I saw that Russell had given this 5 stars as well. From what's Russell's channel?
Ink and Paper Blog.
Blog. Sarah likes to say blob.
No, I always say that accidentally. Not like to. I do it accidentally. Ink and Paper Blob.
Ink and Paper Blog. So Russell gave it 5 stars as well. So yeah, it's I really, really love it and highly recommend it. And don't be put off if you didn't like Wild by her, because it's just, yeah, it's wonderful.
My first recommendation is Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor, which is, Shashi Tharoor is an Indian politician and kind of public speaker. And this book is about the British colonisation of India. Well, colonisation is the wrong word. What's the word I'm looking for? Occupation, let's say. The British occupation of India. And what happened in India for like the 200 years that that Britain was there, I guess. The long-lasting effects that has had on India economically, culturally, that kind of thing. And it's very grim as a read, because he just sort of, he's extremely comprehensive as a writer, and he just like breaks it down point by point. Like, look, this is the facts, these are the numbers. Like, let's talk about the number of people here. Let's talk about the changes in the economy. And it's extremely well written, extremely well researched, but yeah, it's really difficult to read. He's also an extremely academic writer. He writes in a way that I think a lot of authors wish they did. You know, when someone is writing and they use this word that doesn't fit the rest of their... It looks like they've just looked at something on a thesaurus, and you're like, okay, you clearly just use that word because you want to sound intelligent. He does that like genuinely without... He sort of has this effortful, highly academic, highly intellectual way of writing, which I was like absolutely in awe of. Yeah, so it's really, really good. Couldn't recommend it more, really, but it's a very heavy read.
Yeah, I have it out from the library at the moment, but I've literally picked it up. I've got too many books out, so...
Do you really?
Yeah.
That's weird. That's a weird coincidence.
So I definitely want to read it, but yeah, I think it might take me a while, because I thought it looked like a more academic, which is why I picked it up.
Yeah, definitely is that. He's a very good speaker. Actually, we can list in the show notes. He did a really good speech at a debate in Oxford a few years ago about whether or not, about the concept of reparations, and whether countries that colonize should owe reparations. And it's not about like the actual money side of it, but conceptually, if that should be a thing. And he's just a really excellent speaker, and it gives you like quite a good flavour of how he talks. So we can link them.
So my next one is about, well, it's called The Inconvenient Indian, A Curious Account of Native People in North America by Thomas King. Thomas King was predominantly a fiction writer, and I haven't actually read any of his novels, although I would like to. And I read this a few years ago, and it's really stuck with me. I've read quite a few books about colonisation of North America, and just how horrendous in every way it possibly was. And this is the one that has really stuck out because it's fairly short. It's around 260 pages. And what he does is, rather than talking about it chronologically, which usually does work for me in this sense, he talks about it thematically. So, like, for example, one chapter is on the representation of Indigenous people in the media, and he'll talk about, like, famous actors who were actually white and were always cast in the roles of Indigenous people. And then another chapter is focused on children and things like that, and he focuses on different topics. Like, for example, one of the topics he focuses on is lots of the treaties that happened in order to take land off the Indigenous people and to sort of put them on these reserves and then continuously shrink the reserves. So one thing, I read this a few years ago, and I'd say it's probably the book I read that introduced me to the topic. Although I think, bizarrely, this is one of the things I did study at school when I was like 14. So, like, one thing my school did well, I guess. And I think they actually presented it like that we were the dickheads. So, like, they didn't try and portray it to make us look good, which is usually the case, I think. So I think this is fairly introductory in that he sort of does it thematically. It's not dry at all. And also, he writes with a quite dark sense of humour. I don't really like humour in books just because I think humour is so specific. My sense of humour is usually like about quite dark things that are in no way funny, but like that feels like sometimes it's the only way to actually talk about those topics, and that's 100% how he deals with them. There's a lot of irony when he tells you really horrific statistics and historical events. He'll end it with a joke, and you just think, oh, like, this is twisted sort of thing. But it really stuck with me, and I've recommended it so much, and I would love to see more people pick it up. And I really do think, like I said, I've read books since then that are more dry, much longer, and I've always had, like, I'm on the hunt to find one that is, like, I guess, longer, that doesn't annoy me in some other way. I found that some of them have a serious lack of discussion about women, and some of them are just perhaps like a bit too dry. Mm-hmm. And this is the one that, so at the moment, is the one I would like recommend about that topic.
I actually have the audiobook of this, which he narrates.
Yes, he does. I think I'm going to listen, because I've not read it since I read it a few years ago, and I definitely want to sort of listen to it, because I think he'll narrate it really well.
My next one is Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thomson, which I think I was reading this last year, so I think I probably talked about this in a previous episode. But so Polynesia, if anyone doesn't know, it's the area from New Zealand to Easter Island to Hawaii. That kind of triangle in the Pacific Ocean is Polynesia, and it is about. And it's such a fascinating book. So Christina Thomson, she starts off about 500 years ago or so, and she's talking about the way in which the people who were native to that part of the world actually ended up living on all of these islands, because they're very, very far away from each other, thousands of kilometres, some of them, how they would navigate, how they managed to sort of create the sort of inhabitable place in these incredibly remote islands. It was fascinating to read about, and a lot of the skills unfortunately have been lost, and no one really knows how they would navigate or anything like that. But she is really good at describing just the emptiness of that part of the world, and she talks a lot about how, for example, if you were a Polynesian and you wanted to go from one island to another, it would be very common that you would get in your wooden canoe and you wouldn't be able to see anything but water for hours and hours, days and days and days sometimes, and they were still somehow able to navigate, which is a skill that has now been completely lost. And she also talks a bit about, quite a lot actually, about the European colonization of that part of the world and how that actually worked, because there were, for quite a long period of time, Europeans were actually trading with the Polynesians and doing horrific things there, but also trying to get knowledge from them as well, and how that kind of worked and how that broke down, and some of the horrific things that happened in Polynesia as well. And I just thought it was, just loved it. Really liked the tone of it, hit that nice mix of academic and sort of more conversational writing, and thought it was excellent.
Yeah, I remember, was this maybe part of the BookTube prize a year or two ago?
I heard about it through Britta Burler's channel, so I can't remember in what context, but yeah, definitely from her I heard about it.
Yeah, I think it might have been one of the books that was, in one of their groups, because I remember hearing quite a few people talk about it then. I don't know, I'm really bad with like terms for non-fiction. Like memoir's an easy term to be like, but a lot of it is like, it's really different, but I don't know if there's actual titles for like other than you could be like, this is about science or whatever. But I think that's probably what I lack in non-fiction. Like I like to read memoirs, essays that are like a blend of the personal and the like social commentary, and then I like to read about like history. But I hear people talk about like topics that are quite like more specific, and I think I don't tend to read stuff like that, and I would love to, but I just never make time for it, and I should.
Is that narrative non-fiction?
I don't know, like the one you mentioned, was it called Dead Mountain? Like I've never read a book, do you know what I mean? Like I just don't think I read stuff that's more, I don't know what you even call that.
I don't know either.
It a title in a
okay,
minute,
you are
it's totally made up.
Okay, so yeah, I just think there's a massive part. Even though I love non-fiction, I think there's a really big portion of non-fiction that I still need. I'm yet to read.
About, really.
Yeah.
It's so hard to find these kind of books. I find really, really hard because most of them are shit. I hate to say it, but it's true.
Yeah.
You got to wait for someone that you I don't like when people say trust the reviews of when your views align with that person, when they're like, oh, this was good.
Yeah.
I also find it hard to. I want to read quite a lot of books that are a nice overview of like a period of time or something like that. I feel like I need that because I also feel like my education is really lacking. Like I just read a really good book about the Renaissance, and that's also really hard to find. Like, okay, let's discuss this whole thing. This is how it started. This is sort of the end of it. These are the kind of different factors at play without them being like a super white-centric, Western-centric or whatever perspective. That mix is really difficult to find, I find.
So my next one is that mix between the personal and also talking about different topics, and that is Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land by Toni Jensen. I think this only came out last year or perhaps late the year before, and I heard amazing reviews, so I picked up in print. I don't know if it's available on audio, but if it is, it would be a great one to listen to. And I found this fascinating in so many ways. One of the things I found fascinating is so in terms of it being, so it's essays that are non-chronological and they're more thematic, but when I describe it, it's going to sound like that's talking about too many things and it's just not going to discuss any of them in any depth, but that isn't the case. She talks about all these things and it makes complete sense why she's linking them. But one thing she does, before I say what it's actually about, is that she does give you examples from her own life, but she'll like pull the rug out from under you and say, you want to know how okay, so there's an example she gives. Her nephew is part Métis and part African American, and his neighbour threatens him because they think because of the colour of his skin, that he doesn't live there and he's, just on their property or whatever. And partway through telling that, she says, I'm not going to tell you how it ends, because the fact that you want to know that is in itself not really the point I'm trying to make. And so she touches on a lot of elements of her life, but she really clearly draws the line, and not just to sort of protect herself, but to question why you as the reader feel that is important rather than the topic she's discussing. It sort of like puts the brakes on that curiosity, and it worked really well. So what she's in large part discussing is the link between gun violence and domestic abuse, but she also ties in commentary to the experience of Indigenous people in America and how whenever she's talking about a certain event, she'll link it to, she'll somehow, you read it and you think, how can somebody have been this close to that much gun violence? And yet, the way in which she talks about it makes you realise that actually it must be really commonplace, because a lot of her life she's lived in areas that perhaps aren't as wealthy, that local councils don't care about as much, and so she'll sort of talk about somewhere she lives, and then she'll talk about how she was close to sometimes a victim and sometimes a perpetrator, and then she'll link it all back. But she makes a really interesting distinction between the term domestic violence and what we mean when we say that, and what we mean when we say gun violence, and the knee-jerk reaction we feel when we hear those terms, and how actually they're much more linked than we think they are, in the fact that the vast majority of people who commit gun violence were also somebody who committed domestic violence, and if we'd have resolved that issue, the gun violence would never have happened. And it's brilliant. Yeah, she sort of links all these things as well as a personal narrative, incredibly intelligent. Like it was phenomenal and really beautifully written. And she talks about like the dictionary definitions of words and how these words were created and how we use them to mean something different than they were originally intended. And that sounds like it wouldn't fit, but it really does. It's really good.
That sounds really good. Is it long?
No, it's just under 300 pages.
Oh,
so that sounds like a lot to do in that time.
It does.
But it really doesn't. It didn't feel that way to me. It felt like somebody was pulling these things together that actually made complete sense to be together, and that actually to discuss these things separately would be doing them a disservice because they're so inherently linked.
Interesting. What was it called?
Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land.
This feels sort of a completely irrelevant comment to make, but the cover is really beautiful.
It really is, yeah.
Last thing I wanted to talk about, this isn't what it's called, I'm sure. I totally get what you mean by the sort of subgenres of non-fiction. Yeah, I don't know what they are either. Are they named? I don't know.
There's one I've heard people say is like adventure non-fiction.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to call it...
There's like disaster non-fiction for sure.
Yeah, so that's what... So, a subgenre that I really like, I've written disaster non-fiction,
okay.
But disaster expedition non-fiction, which is the most specific subgenre ever. But there's loads of books out there that are expedition disaster novels.
I haven't read any like that. Like, I haven't read it, and there's so many that are like so recommended, and I've never read any of them.
I'm probably going to end up naming some now. So I think, do you know what? When I was at uni, I really didn't read anything. So I definitely went through a period when I was probably a late teen through to when I finished university where I basically didn't read anything. And the books that I started back with were, ironically, Ben's books. He barely reads, but he owned a lot of non-fiction, like disaster related books, and they're still the ones that have really stuck with me, and I have so many on my Goodreads on my TBR that I want to get to. But the ones that I really enjoyed, and these are well-known ones, are certainly not loads of them have been made into films, but I really liked Touching the Void by Joe Simpson's. He's a mountaineer called Joe Simpson, and I'm not going to remember the mountain it was in, but him and his expedition partner are climbing some mountain or another, and they fall into this...
I've seen this documentary.
Yeah, it's a documentary film, and they fall into this crevasse, and his mountaineering partner has to cut his line, because otherwise they're both going to die. Which is usually any kind of disaster film. I feel like that's the storyline, that someone needs the line cut in, and but he doesn't die. He's just horrifically injured and makes his way back down the mountain. And I think that was probably the first one I read where I was just completely fascinated by humans and humans' desire to do things that just seem subhuman and that we shouldn't be able to do, or putting your life at risk like that. I just can't imagine doing it, but I find it absolutely fascinating, and I find people that have to do that in their life for their lives to feel fulfilled fascinating. Touching the Void I really loved, and the other one I really liked, which I think will segue nicely into a non-fiction that Sarah's going to talk about, is Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. And that was about I'm not going to remember the date, like 1996 I want to say, or 92, Everest disaster expedition that he was on as a journalist, and I think most of them died on the descent down, apart from maybe like 3 of them out of a group of 10. I'm doing it from memory now. There's a film on that as well, quite a recent one, just called Everest, I think. He's a really good writer, and he also wrote Into the Wild, which I also loved. And I know that Sarah wants to talk about one of his books. So
I haven't read any of his books, and they all sound
really good. He's a
fascinating.
journalist.
Yeah.
He's very multi-skilled. I mean, the one I'm about to talk to is completely different to any of these, which is
different.
Into the Wild is one of those ones where unfortunately you don't get much of a resolution
No.
about the sort of reasoning behind why that guy went into the wilderness. But yeah,
or why he did it the way he did, because
there's lots of sort of unanswered questions.
There's levels of stupidity in what he did that just doesn't make any sense.
No,
like
it's
he just
weird.
like didn't take a map with him, or just didn't do anything like that. So.
But yeah, Into Thin Air I really liked. Everest is so interesting, actually. Just the logistics of Everest is just... I was really surprised when I started reading a bit about Everest. The way that if you want to climb Everest, how that actually works is not at all like I thought it was. I was kind of imagining that you would, I don't know, drive up to the car park, sign the logbook and get going. No,
Off you go!
Yeah, it's quite sinister and just... Yeah, it's quite destructive, environmentally speaking, and the way that they do it. And there's all these hikers that have just been there for decades.
And how they kind of rely on the local Sherpas and... Yeah, there's kind of not just the ethics around just the environment, but also how the kind of local people are treated, even though they rely on that kind of tourism, to call it tourism.
Yeah.
It's just... I find Everest fascinating.
And it's just littered with bodies.
That they can't get back down again.
Yeah, I mean, when I watched that, what was the first one you mentioned where he falls down the crevasse?
Into the void, touching the void.
Yeah.
Into the void.
When I watched that, it's one of the most... I haven't seen it in probably a decade, but it's one of the most memorable films I've ever watched. I remember thinking, there's so many points at which I'd have thought, I'm just going to die.
Yeah, just leave me.
I'm just going to give up. And I just think, mainly, it just made me realise that, like, God, some people must have such a desire, or just way less lazy than I am, because I'd just be like, fuck this, like, I can't be bothered to crawl over those ice shards with a broken leg, like, just leave me, like,
just end it.
Yeah,
drag myself down the hill.
So I think all these people in this, you're calling it disaster non-fiction, are just very active, and the polar opposite to... So I guess that's why it's fascinating, that I can't comprehend why they'd even want to use up that much energy, let alone...
In the first place, I guess.
Yeah.
My last recommendation is Under the Banner of Heaven by Jon Krakauer, which is actually about fundamentalist Mormons. I think we've talked a little bit about Jon Krakauer, so he's an investigative journalist in the US. And this book starts off with him investigating a double murder that occurred in a Mormon community, but then he's sort of trying to understand who did this and why, and then it turns out that there was that these people were polygamous, and he's trying to understand just the mechanics of what was actually happening and where the conflict was, and then it ends up he does sort of touch back to the murder a bit as he goes through the book, but it ends up being much more about this group of people and the issue of polygamy in Mormonism. I found it really, really interesting. It was probably one of the first non-fiction books that I read where I was reading something that I didn't know anything about it at all, really, and I just felt like every sort of page that I was reading was like a whole new world for me, really. And he goes back to the sort of beginnings, a little bit the beginnings of Mormonism, and also how this issue of polygamy became a real issue of contention in the religion, and how there's kind of branches of Mormonism, and how this issue of polygamy is kind of what divides them. And he talks about this particular group in Utah and how they broke off and how it actually works. And I learned so much about it. It's very much taking the perspective. He very much disagrees with the concept of polygamy, the way that they do it, because it's quite gendered, right? So it's always the way that you have one man with multiple wives. And he takes issue with that, which is very obvious on the page. I didn't have an issue with that because I would be the same. I would have the same opinion that, like, if everyone can't do it, then no one's having it, you know?
Yeah.
But he does get a lot of negative reviews for that, for sure. And he also talks a lot about age of consent and what it means to be consensual as a young person, as a child, when you're, like, being raised in this way. I just found it absolutely fascinating. Really loved it.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And I guess that's, like, he's everything he writes is under like investigative reporting, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I think I just need to read more stuff like that, because it all just sounds like, I love documentaries but I don't tend to reflect that in my reading. I don't know why, really, because I hear about these books and I think they sound deeply fascinating, but then I don't actually pick them up.
I think, like you were saying, when you look at the bibliographies at the end, it's worth doing the same with films, because I feel like I saw Into the Wild first and I was like, oh, what's that, you know, what is there a book I can read about that? And that's how I found Jon Krakauer, and then read his Everest one, and then watched a documentary with him in it. And I mean, has he got any other books? He must have.
Yeah, I think I've read all of them, I think, because I really like them. And he's also got one called Missoula.
Yeah, that's the one I was the most interested in, I think.
Yeah. Which is about a town in Missoula is a town in Minnesota, I think, and it's essentially about how you can get away with anything in terms of sexual assault if you're popular enough, basically. And he talks about like the culture of football in America and how these sort of disgusting young men get away with all this horrific behaviour because they're thought to be like quote unquote stars. And juries feel bad about convicting them because they'll interfere with their future as like football stars. So yeah, that was an infuriating book, but it was very good.
Cool. Well, I think that's everything we wanted to talk about. Thank you, Mercedes, for coming on. We hope you'll come back. I think
of course.
Chris is desperate that you'll come back and do an episode with him. So yeah, thank you. That's great. Where can people find you online?
Oh God, I am on YouTube under Mercy's Bookish Musings, and I think I'm on Instagram under just Mercy's Musings.
So there's a lot of content on that Instagram.
Yeah, I don't post on there at all. But if you want to see a photo of my cat from 2 years ago, then again, lazy.
We'll link to your YouTube channel and your Instagram so people can come and find you. Yeah, if any of our listeners have got any good non-fiction recommendations, then do send them our way, because it is hard to find the good stuff, I think. Yeah, thank you for listening. As always, if you would like to get in touch with us with any questions, ideas, feedback, or book recommendations, you can email us on thebookcastclub@outlook.com. You can tweet us or send us a message on Instagram where we're at bookcastclub. You can leave us a voice message, voice messages that we'd love to use on the podcast. The link is in the show notes. You can sign up to our newsletter for more reviews, new releases, podcast recommendations and more. And you can obviously check us out on Patreon. But thanks for listening, and we'll be back very soon.